Okay. Oh, okay. Let's see. If you want anything in terms of background. Okay, great. Thank you. And the first book was The Chronic Crisis of Legitimacy. What was the exact word again? Yeah, I like it's a Lord of the Rings reference, right? I like that a lot. So yes, as I said, I'm gonna go live in here in a few seconds, but it'll be still a couple minutes before we are ready. Be not afraid. You're listening to WRFG Atlanta. Welcome. You're listening to Solution Space here on WRFG Atlanta. I'm your host, Adam Wadley, and today I'm joined by a very special guest. We're joined by Benjamin Studebaker. Thanks so much, Benjamin, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Wonderful. Yes. Dr. Studebaker is releasing a book on November 30th that's called Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, and has already published the book in 2023 called Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut. You can find Dr. Studebaker, Benjamin, on Twitter or X under the handle BM Studebaker. And Studebaker is spelled Stude, and then like the word Baker, Baker. Dr. Studebaker completed his PhD at the University of Cambridge, and as you can tell from both of the book titles, again, Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, as well as Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, Dr. Studebaker studies the question of public faith in governments and institutions, and especially the United States government. So thank you again, Dr. Studebaker, for joining us today.
I'm so excited to talk about this with you. I love this stuff.
Me too. People who listen to my radio show regularly are used to me waxing philosophical, as it were. So I'm really excited to be able to speak with you who think so in depth about these topics. But I think for the sake of our listening audience, and also just I think for both of us, to get a good starting point to discuss what we have to discuss today. And of course, one of the key contexts for our discussion is that the President-elect Trump is releasing these cabinet picks. And so we've had Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, and Pete Hegseth, a Fox host, for Secretary of Defense, and Tulsi Gabbard, who some people think is a Russian agent, for the Director of National Intelligence. So, things are getting more and more interesting all the time. And so in that context, it's a very good time to be discussing legitimacy, liberal democracies, and of course, the United States government as one of these liberal democracies. But to start us off here, Benjamin, could you talk a little bit about what legitimacy means to you? I think we can think about this doesn't seem legitimate, and think about the legitimacy, but more specifically, how would you flesh that out for people who aren't so used to using legitimacy as a term of art?
Yeah, so political legitimacy is to do with whether people endorse or failing that, accept with some reluctance, the political system that they live under. And you can imagine legitimacy as having maybe different levels to it. At the very, very highest level, you might imagine a case where people accept everything the government does, endorse everything the government does, and never criticize any of it ever at all, right? That would be a kind of a perfect legitimacy that's more than any government ever enjoys. Then there's maybe a full legitimacy where people accept the procedures by which the decisions are taken, but disagree with some of the decisions, right? So you might not like some of the people who are appointed, you might not like some of the laws that are passed or some of the decisions that the courts issue, but you nonetheless endorse the procedures that produce those decisions. And you think that the next time there's a decision to be taken, there's a fair chance that your side will come out and prevail. Then we would have another level of further disagreement where you start to problematize the procedures themselves and argue that various kinds of procedural reform is necessary to make the system of government functional. You might think maybe you need electoral reform, maybe you need to reform the Supreme Court, maybe you need to reform the Senate, uh, maybe you need to change campaign finance law, maybe you need to do something about the Federal Reserve. Right at this point, there's a quite serious level of frustration with the way that the government functions, but there's still a commitment to democracy, to the overall system of government. At the very, very lowest level, you start to have what I call liminal legitimacy, a case where there's sizable numbers of people with real influence and power who think that a completely different system of government might be much better than the one we have. And at that point, you are in an environment where coups and revolutions and civil conflict become possible. But kind of the thesis of my book is that we get stuck in the level of relitigating the procedures without slipping down into that level of civil conflict. So there's a lot of feeling that our system doesn't work, but there is a lack of belief that there's a different system altogether that would be much better that we could achieve through a revolution. So what people tend to do is they argue about and continuously relitigate the procedures.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I also think it's good to unpack this term liberal democracy, not least because here in America, of course, we think of liberal and conservative, right? So when we think of liberals, we think of, Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or something like that. But of course, people might not be as familiar with the idea of the liberal tradition, going back hundreds of years and really comprising both Democrats and Republicans. People might be familiar with more conservative or traditionalist voices talking about classical liberalism. So maybe you can touch on that as well as you sort of unpack for us this idea of liberal democracy.
Yeah, liberalism can mean a lot of different things. I think there are really three different aspects to liberalism that tend to be important in somebody's account of it. One would be an emphasis on the individual as the unit that needs to be the audience for legitimation. So liberal theorists will tend to say that you've got to make a case to individuals as to why they should endorse or support the system of government, that it's not enough to make a case to groups or to organizations, but that the case has to be made to individuals as individuals. A second component might be a commitment to markets, to market economics, free market economics, or some kind of market economic system. I think many liberals have some level of commitment to that because they believe that a market economic system, in some way, shape, or form, takes up the desires of individuals and balances them in some kind of way. And then the third component to liberalism would be some commitment to pluralism, to there being multiple different political parties, political forces that have a real competitive shot at winning elections, that you have a civil discourse, civil society that includes lots of different perspectives and voices. Now, different liberals emphasize to different degrees each of those three things. And you don't necessarily have to agree with all three of them to be a liberal, But I do think those are the three things that are usually important when in political theory we talk about liberalism. With regard to democracy, I want to make it clear that some people, when they hear this, they'll go, well, we don't have a democracy, we have a republic, or we don't have a democracy. Our institutions fall short of various values that we have to do with liberty or equality or representation or participation. And all of that criticism is potentially fair. But there's a need to talk about democracy not just as an ideal, but also as a kind of system that exists. And when we call these systems democracies, we're not necessarily praising them. We're not necessarily saying that they're good or perfect or that they perfectly embody any particular set of human values. We're really talking about, is this a system that has competitive multi-party elections most of the time? Is this a system where there's at least two parties and the same party doesn't win every election? If you've got that going, and then you also have some commitment to at least one, maybe two or three of those things that I put under the category of liberal, then you're probably talking about a liberal democracy. At the very least, liberal democracies have a self-understanding. They understand themselves to be liberal and to be democratic, and they legitimate themselves in these terms. They invoke these kinds of concepts as part of explaining themselves or justifying their acts. That doesn't mean that we have to agree with their self-characterization, but it is a self-characterization, and many of the citizens will believe it in practice. They will be convinced oftentimes by these kinds of arguments.
Yes, that really draws to mind for me the idea of trust in government. Something people talk about a lot. Oh, there's not enough trust in government, and we're so concerned. People don't talk as much about trustworthiness of government. But so I think legitimacy carries that connotation where it's about being approval. It's about people obeying in a way. It's not even necessarily most directly about whether the government that people believe in is really serving their interests. It's more so what's the perception. But with all that being said, I think it's obviously such a great time, as I said before, to be talking about legitimacy and liberal democracies. But you've been doing this work for years, Benjamin. And so I wanted to ask you, what drove you? We've obviously, as you said, or as the title of your book suggests, we've been in a chronic crisis of American democracy. I remember when I was a teenager being in the wake of the 9/11 attack and the Patriot Act, and the idea of the international law and things going on with Iraq and Afghanistan, those invasions. And so the idea of the legitimacy of the United States government being in question is the sort of idea I'm used to. I probably thought about that in various ways for 15 years. But what led you to want to study this so seriously academically? And how might you describe your overall approach and some of the takeaways overall from your reading and learning so far?
Yeah. In terms of why I got into this stuff, I was a weird kid. I started following politics when I was 8 years old during the 2000 election. I developed a weird obsession with the Gore Bush election and with the debates about the Social Security lockbox. And it just went from there. I've been following politics for most of my adult life and a lot of my pre adult life. And uh, for me, the thing that I noticed is that these events keep happening that are undermining confidence in the institutions. Things like the Iraq War, things like the global economic crisis of 2008, things like the COVID-19 pandemic. And the state has struggled, I think, to respond to these crises in ways that restore confidence and restore this sense of legitimacy. And so, one of the things that stuck with me is this question of, well, what happens if nothing is done to restore legitimacy? Would it produce a revolution? Would it produce a civil conflict? But that doesn't seem to be what's happening. Instead, we seem to just be getting more and more disagreement. And so, one of the things that I argue in the new book is that all legitimation stories, all explanations can look like ideology to other people in society. And one of the things that tends to happen, I think, is as you get a very, very large amount of disagreement, you reach a point where it doesn't look like it's possible for you to win or for you to accomplish anything with a fight. And if you've lost belief in your ability to accomplish anything with fighting, the moment where the disagreement is big but not too big, that's the moment when you can fight, right? When you have two or three sides that each think they have a real chance of winning that are quite sharply different from each other, that's when you can have a civil conflict. But if you don't have a civil conflict because the sides don't think that they can accomplish anything by fighting, what will happen is that the disagreement will just continue to further permeate, and all of the sides that initially you had at the start will split and further fracture into more and more sides. So the case I kind of make in this book is that what we've got going at this point is an enormous amount of disagreement that doesn't just extend to a kind of polarized left versus right, but which has eaten away at the unity of the left, the unity of the right, the degree to which concepts like the left and right make sense, our ability to track which ideas belong to what sides. And that what we've got is, and I depict it on the front cover of the book, is a hydra, this state that has an enormous number of different narratives that it's telling to try to legitimate itself. These narratives all conflict with each other. They inspire enormous amounts of critique and opposition. And so you would think there's so much criticism of the state, there's so little trust in it, people are so angry and so upset. Doesn't this mean that this state has to collapse? And I've seen a lot of people in the public go, aren't we headed toward a national divorce? Aren't we headed towards some kind of civil war? But the thing is, if you have a really, really large amount of disagreement, then there is no organized force which is in position to prevail in a fight. Many of the different arguments that are being made are believed in by some parts of the population. So even though many people reject many of the stories the state is telling, there's usually some set of stories that the state is telling that are still persuasive for them. So the way they experience the state is that, well, these elected officials would do good things if only all of these other people would stop obstructing them. This part of the state is the good part, and if only these other bad parts would get out of the way, then the system would work. What we need to do, people think, is purify the procedures so that the good part of the state can finally beat the bad parts of the state. And the function of this is to lock everything up and produce a lot of gridlock and a lot of immobility, which is very frustrating, but doesn't necessarily take us anywhere.
All right, we've got to take a quick break, but we'll be right back here on WRFG Atlanta. Welcome. You are listening to Solution Space here on WRFG Atlanta, and today I'm joined by Dr. Benjamin Studebaker, the author of a 2023 book called The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut, and the book, which is coming out this year in just 16 days on November 30th, Legitimacy in American Democracy. Thanks again, Dr. Studebaker, for joining me here on WRFG Atlanta.
Thanks. It's legitimacy in liberal democracies.
I'm sorry. What did I say? Did I say anything?
You said American democracy.
Oh, okay. That's not too well. Anyway, apologies about
just in case people Google it.
Yes. Well, absolutely. Legitimacy in liberal democracies coming out November 30th. So now, Benjamin, I think it's funny. I experience a little bit of giddiness. I think with again, Donald Trump is making all of these announcements that he's going to nominate Matt Gaetz to be the attorney general and Pete Hegseth. I never even knew that person, but some person from Fox News who is a combat veteran, but never really ran anything. Now there's going to run the Department of Defense, apparently. And then there's a little bit of giddiness. Of course, this is still the pre-time of the Trump administration, so atrocities haven't started piling up or anything. But there's I think a certain level of giddiness just because it feels good in a way to see this United States government be humiliated in a way, because it has felt so stifling to live under it. Anyway, I with that being said, I'm just so excited to discuss this ongoing nominations process with you. So please just let me know what's going on in your mind as you're watching these various nominations be announced by Donald Trump.
Yeah, so the Republicans understand the bureaucracy, or what they call the administrative state or the deep state, to be the bad part of the state that they need to find a way to overcome. And they think that if they're able to, in some way, reform or clear out this part of the state, that this will restore the democratic character of our political system, that democracy is being restrained by bureaucrats, technocrats, civil servants, unelected people who are there because of a university background or having passed a civil service exam. They understand those people to be the people who are in the way of the expression of the democratic voice, which would otherwise occur through the elections. That's their self-understanding. I'm not suggesting I agree with it, but that's how they see this system. So as they're trying to populate the government with cabinet appointments, they are having this difficulty, which is that many of the people who are experienced in government, who would have the background that would be necessary to run a government department, many of these people don't agree with their critique of the civil service or of the bureaucracy, don't share their politics, don't share their view, and are therefore likely to not fully cooperate and to potentially use their experience and their skill at running bureaucracy to stymie the things that the administration wants to do. Conversely, there are these other people who do share the critique and have the same view of the system, but don't have very much government experience, and so are likely to have a hard time running a government department, may find that the civil servants in their department are not fully cooperative with them, and may have a hard time getting control over those civil servants without simply resorting to a lot of firing. And of course, if you fire people, you can get rid of people that you don't like, but then you have to replace them. And if you replace them with people who don't have a lot of experience in government service, then the problem is replicated further down at other levels of the bureaucracy. So that's what I really think is going on here. The Republicans really think of themselves as purifying or restoring democracy. That really is their objective as they understand it. And part of the trouble is that we have such divergent understandings of what democracy should mean, how it should be procedurally instantiated. The disagreement has gone so deep that at this point, from the point of view of the Democrats, what the Republicans are trying to do looks anti-democratic. It looks like an attack on democracy, because for the Democrats, these civil servants are an essential part of democracy. This is where the skill in government is, as they see it. This is where the expertise is, the qualifications that are necessary to have a good operating state that is able to execute public policy. So they see the Republicans as attempting to politicize something which shouldn't be politicized and which has a kind of appropriate role to play in the democratic schema. So these are very different understandings procedurally of how democracy should work. They're both motivated, though, by a commitment to democracy. Neither side understands themselves to be advocating fascism or communism, despite the accusations of the other side. And that's what I think really distinguishes this kind of legitimation crisis from an old-fashioned crisis like you might associate with, say, Germany in the 30s, where you have some people who actually want communism and other people who actually want fascism, and a set of liberals in the middle trying to avoid the regime collapsing and becoming either of those two alternatives. That's not what we have here. What we have here is two different groups of Democrats, in terms of democratic, committed to democracy people, who have completely divergent notions of how that should be procedurally instantiated.
I'm curious. I did a class on David Hume's moral philosophy one time, and I remember reading David Hume, who is a Scottish philosopher, from the 1700s, and noted liberal philosopher. I think he David Hume was writing something like, "Oh, you want to appoint magistrates that have a lot of property so that they won't have much of an interest in a given court proceeding. So they'll be disinterested, and then they'll make a good decision." And I just remember thinking, like, how can David Hume be this naive, just to think that somebody is not going to have their sense of interest expand to the realm of their decision making, to where they'll take an interest if they can somehow understand that they can use this power anyway. But I'm thinking even more broadly, liberalism as a project. Maybe I can throw it back to you again at the end of this question, but in terms of when it started. But I mean, liberalism is going on around the time of chattel slavery, colonialism, conquest of peoples, trafficking, all these atrocities and acts of war. And at the same time, we have the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and this idea that all men are created equal and all this sort of thing. And so I'm curious whether, as you say, Dr. Studebaker, that we are, uh, or many different factions here in the United States at least, say that they're committed to democracy. But there's an issue that it seems like we're not quite sure what that means after all. And I'm curious whether you might connect that ambiguity to the fact that there's been basically, you could say, hypocrisy or a lack of integrity to within the liberal ethical political system for a very long time now.
Hmm. Yeah, Hume is an interesting figure. At the point at which Hume is making that argument, it isn't agreed by most people in the government that people who don't have property should have any role at all in politics. So, from the point of view of that particular period in history, to say that people who don't have property should be given any kind of role is a radical proposition relative to what had gone before, where it was assumed that if you didn't have property, you wouldn't be able to cultivate the virtues in the Aristotelian sense. The old medieval arguments about why property is necessary come from Aristotle, who argued that a person who doesn't have property can't acquire the virtues and therefore can't engage in human reason. Uh, yeah. So Hume's position there is actually radical for that time period. But of course, to us, it seems insufficient. I would say that in the second chapter of my new book, there's a discussion I have about hypocrisy. And I think that while sometimes particular leaders are hypocritical, the most difficult kind of hypocrisy that we get is a kind of structural hypocrisy, an impersonal hypocrisy, where our government pits multiple sincere actors against each other. You have politicians who sincerely believe in the causes that they're struggling for. People like Bernie Sanders, people like Donald Trump, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, people like Jeb Bush. All of these different people in their own minds are sincere about their beliefs, about their understanding of democracy. But nonetheless, the procedures stick them in each other's way. So that the state is constantly, through these different people, telling different stories about what democracy means and what it requires. And the effect of this is that the population is divided up on the basis of these different narratives and stories and is constantly arguing with itself over what democracy means and whether the democratic state actually owes people anything at all. And this constant conflict about the meaning of the term and the meaning of the procedures, I think is the substantive hypocrisy at the heart of the system. But it goes beyond people lying or people being dishonest. It really comes down to, this is a system which, because it has so many different offices that it generates, is constantly speaking for itself from different mouths, different individually sincere mouths that nonetheless conflict with each other.
Yes, I sent you a document called "The Army in Military Competition" that was put out by the U.S. Army, and it was emphasizing, this notion of reputation. It also emphasized this idea of playing to multiple audiences, which also, from a spiritual perspective, reminds me of a concept in Buddhism, which is called upaya, or skillful means. It's basically the idea that the Buddha is not necessarily trying to tell you the truth; it's trying to tell you what you need to hear. And so, from the perspective of the state, it's like, you'll be told whatever you need to hear to believe in the state, or whatever it wants you to do. Sorry, I kind of lost my train of thought there. I do need to be jumping in here, though, here in the middle, to remind everybody that you're listening to WRFG Atlanta. My name is Adam Wadley, and here I am joined today by Dr. Benjamin Studebaker, the author of 2 books. One came out last year. It's called The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut. And Dr. Studebaker has another book, which is being released here on November 30th, which is called Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. You can find Dr. Studebaker's work on his website at benjaminstudebaker.com. In case you don't know, Studebaker is Studebaker. And you can also find Benjamin on Twitter or X under the handle at BMStudebaker. So again, thank you so much for joining me here. Again, the immediate context, we're discussing Trump's cabinet appointments. I'm interested to follow up on something that you were saying earlier, Dr. Studebaker, about sort of very endemic processes of disagreement, not being able to muster a civil war or conflict because there really isn't enough agreement among any side to muster a really organized force. So I think that you mentioned, the Republicans are trying to deconstruct the administrative state or whatever. Maybe we might want to phrase that. But these Trump appointments to the cabinet, right? Specifically, Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, Pete Hegseth for Department of Secretary of Defense, and Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence. These are setting off alarm bells, right, for Senate Republicans. We just had the election for the new leader of the Senate. I forget the majority leader, right? And so the Trump appointee, the Rick Scott, the favored person who was going to be the rubber stamp for Donald Trump, was actually not selected. And so John Thune, if I'm remembering that correctly, has been elected. So, how are you looking at the disagreements within the Republican Party, and what bearing might that have for those of us who are, most concerned that, we're about to see, I don't even know, an intensification of tyranny if it's already here. People who are very afraid for what's going to happen in January. What do the disagreements among the Republicans maybe tell us, or how does that set the stage for what we're thinking about having to do?
Yeah, I think if somebody were to accuse any of us of plotting authoritarianism, the first thing we'd say is, well, there's too many people who disagree on my side for that to possibly happen. There are all these disagreements that people aren't seeing or not noticing that would make it very difficult for us to cooperate together. And in the case of the Republicans, I think very often who are Democrats don't notice the degree to which the Republicans disagree with each other. And conversely, the Republicans or people on the right don't tend to notice the degree to which Democrats disagree with each other. So within the first Trump administration, there were at least 3 different prominent factions. There was the establishment Republican faction that you might associate with someone like Reince Priebus. There was the kind of alt-right Steve Bannon faction that tends to get a lot of the attention and coverage. And then there was Jared Kushner and Ivanka, who had a almost moderate Democrat kind of politics, especially on social issues. And what we tended to see in the first Trump administration is that Trump would appoint people from all of these different camps to positions in the administration, kind of frame it as a team of rivals thing, but that ultimately these people would very much not get along, and there were not good procedures for resolving the disagreements among them. And so what would often happen is that people would find that they weren't actually able to do the things that their office suggested they should be able to do, because other people who disagreed with them would do end runs around the conventional procedures and talk to Donald Trump in person. Steve Bannon, for instance, when he was in the administration, would try to lurk around late in the evening and try to catch Trump at the end of the day in the hopes of having the greatest influence on policy by being the last person that Trump talks to before the end of the business day. So there's an enormous amount of wrangling, people, hiding documents from the president to try to influence his perception of what's going on, people playing all kinds of games. And the tendency was for Ivanka and Jared to prevail, because Ivanka and Jared are members of the family and therefore are quite, you can't really fire them. They have ways of accessing the president that other people don't have. And so they have a structural advantage within that schema. Now, in the new administration, there will be an effort to avoid the problems of the old administration. But the trouble is that there's still many Senate Republicans and even Republicans in the House who do not agree with the very, very anti-administrative wing of the MAGA movement. And you also have further disagreements. You have religious conservatives, social conservatives who are upset about the taking out of the Republican Party platform of the prohibition on abortion, prohibition on gay marriage. You've also got an enormous amount of disagreement about tariffs. There are a lot of Republicans, people like Rand Paul, who are very committed to free trade and don't like tariffs very much at all. And then at the same time, you've got people in the Trump administration who want very muscular tariffs and want a much more constrained trade policy. In the first Trump administration, the way that went is that Trump unilaterally imposed tariffs, and then Congress threatened to take away the president's power to tariff if those tariffs went much further than they did go. So the effect of this was that Trump was able to do some tariffing, but not as much as he might have liked to do, because he had this concern about Republicans in the Senate stripping the tariff power. These kinds of conflicts are going to happen again. And they're going to happen because no matter how much you game plan this, there just is too much disagreement. And if you try to hire people that are loyal to you and you try to do some kind of loyalty test, well, a lot of the opponents of the Trump administration come from within the intelligence services. They come from within the military. And so there will be a lot of people who will be looking for jobs in the Trump administration who will pretend to be loyal to the president when in fact they are not loyal and may have associations with various intelligence groups. And this is going to be in practice very difficult to parse. It's very hard to figure out who is loyal and who's pretending to be loyal so as to get a job.
Yes, it reminds me. I was reading something which was, dangerously feeding empathy for billionaires, but it was telling the story of a billionaire basically, crying into their money, saying, "I can't trust anybody," just because. And I think I actually read something in Adam Smith in that same class about this, where, somebody who's a billionaire can so obviously be useful to so many people that it's hard to distinguish between how they can be useful versus them. So if you're imagining being Donald Trump and wanting people to be loyal to you, it's like, well, people don't necessarily see you, right? You've put yourself in a situation where you're the ultimate means to do anything, right? It's just like people are sitting around trying to, figure out how to make their career by influencing Donald Trump, and it's a very interesting situation. But so I was intrigued by your mention of military and intelligence personnel, and this because I'm reminded again almost of I forget the first name, but Surkov. There was an advisor to Vladimir Putin who had a background in theater, and so had a lot to do with really not just managing, but really confusing people's perceptions. So I'm imagining that sort of thing being going on in this hall of mirrors. But in particular, again, circling back to this question of the military, intelligence, and legitimacy in American democracies. I raised this to you in the question set, but I didn't exactly mention. I'm curious how you see something like the passage of the National Security Act or something like that back in the 40s, because we haven't always had this ridiculously untouchable bureaucracy. We've had bureaucracy for hundreds of years, but like when the Second Amendment was passed, the difference in weaponry wasn't as big as it is now. The difference in information processing, the difference in resource allocation. So how do you see something like the National Security Act as a transformational event in the question of the legitimacy of democracies or of governments like the United States? Because I think it's really only been in those past 80 years or so that we've seen the rise of these military and intelligence bureaucracies that are so powerful that schizophrenics are having bad ideations about that instead of demons now. Like these sorts of institutions have become seemingly so powerful, but they weren't always that way. So I'm curious what reflections you might have on that phenomenon.
Yeah, I think coming out of World War I, the tendency was to scale back after a military confrontation the size of the standing army, because the view was not at that time that the United States should be trying to operate the world system, trying to operate or safeguard global capitalism through its military. That changed after World War II. After World War II, the consensus view was that the United States had to play that role for the world system to operate without a renewed breakout of war. And because elites came to have this view, it became possible to legitimate a much larger standing army than had ever been possible before in the history of the United States. The Red Scare, the sense that if there was no large standing army presence in Europe, that the Soviet Union would overrun Western Europe and would in some way subjugate or dominate these people and pose some kind of growing threat to global capitalism, I think very much was the driving force in legitimating this much larger military. Because, of course, when you have a much larger standing army, you have to raise the tax revenue to fund that, which means that your wealthy people who pay tax have to be convinced that something like that is necessary. And I think in practice, it was very much to do with this sense of a Soviet threat or a communist threat to capitalism and therefore to wealthy people and their assets that persuaded them ultimately that they had to create this large apparatus to safeguard global trade and global capitalism moving forward.
Yes. What's your reading then of, pre-sentiments? I'm thinking in particular of Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address and the John F. Kennedy assassination as being twin events, or two events, I guess we'll say, that just, in my opinion, have done a lot to feed into a legitimacy crisis within the United States. Dwight Eisenhower, of course, was a president, but was talking about the military-industrial complex, and that term remains very embedded. If you start to talk about the sorts of things that we are, MIC will come up, and of course, the John F. Kennedy assassination. Many people, of course, speculate that members of the United States government were involved in that assassination, and other people, of course, don't feel the same way. But some of the records still aren't released 50 years afterwards, and we keep kind of getting baited and switched about that. So I'm curious, following on from this legitimation of a national security state through the unprecedented threats that were faced at that time with the Soviet Union and, of course, the advent of nuclear weapons. But can you talk about those sorts of events in the middle, getting toward the end of the 20th century, that really started to bring up these concerns about the deep state before we really called it that, I guess?
Yeah, I think if you create a large permanent bureaucracy, then you have a lot of people in that large permanent bureaucracy who have many, many, many years of experience, far more than elected officials are likely to get unless they are career politicians. So, one thing that the creation of the bureaucracy does is it compels politicians to try to stay in office longer. Because if you don't have elected politicians who have been in office for 20 plus years, you're not going to have very many people who have the same level of experience as the bureaucrats that they are meant to oversee and regulate. So it forces elected officials to try to stay in office for a very long time just to get to the point of having enough institutional experience to keep up with these bureaucrats who, because they are permanent, always have this advantage over elected officials who have to worry about the next electoral cycle. And so it does create this mistrust, not just on the part of the citizens, but also on the part of the elected officials themselves. And I think particularly on the part of presidents. Presidents became increasingly concerned that this bureaucracy that they had built, which was ostensibly an instrument that they could use to implement their foreign policy, would actually ultimately make it impossible for them to have an independent foreign policy, that they would get assimilated into what some IR scholars call the blob. And this is something that presidents have, with some increasing frequency, been actively concerned about. That they aren't actually able to implement foreign policy. And particularly presidents who make it to their second terms, who have had enough experience in the office to see how things actually go, tend to be more bothered about this than presidents when they're first initially elected. A lot of people, when they're elected to the presidency, they imagine that they'll be able to pursue their policy agenda. They find in various ways that they're not able to get it done. If they make it back in for a second term, are trying to find ways around those blocks that had stymied them to begin with. And I think we tend to see that the most thinking about this happens when there's a gap between the first run and the second run. So in the case of Trump, because there's been a gap, there's been time for him to reflect on all of the things he was not able to do, which has built a frustration and resentment in him of the people that he, upon reflection, recognizes as having obstructed him and his agenda. It's similar in this regard, I think, to the way that Nixon felt when he got in 68, having previously been vice president under Eisenhower in the 50s, and then having run in 1960 and having felt that perhaps he had been messed with. You know, if you go into Richard Nixon's memoirs, he very clearly has concerns about the way the Democrats are behaving in elections. He thinks that they are trying to steal elections from him, that they're not playing fair. And this, in part, inspires him to adopt less ethical tactics in response to what he feels are the Democratic Party tactics. He will claim often in his memoirs that what he was doing was not different in kind or order from what was being done by Democrats. And so when you have a period of a layoff where someone can get tan rested and ready, and then they come back, often when they come back, because they've had some real experience governing, they're viewing these bureaucrats as a competing source of power that they have to contend with. And this is in part why in his memoir, Nixon argues that the two-term limit for presidents is a mistake, that what it does is it creates a lame duck second term, so that by the time you get to the second term and you know how to run the thing, you're a lame duck and nobody thinks you have any credibility to potentially give them anything or do anything to them beyond the second term. So at the point at which the president starts to understand the system, the president is then getting ready to leave. And this problem, Nixon in that book argues it takes at least 2 years for a president to actually figure out how any of it works. So, and then if you lose your legislative majority, which many presidents do at that first midterm, that means that right at the moment when you're starting to figure out how it works, you no longer have the congressional support necessary to move forward.
The vicissitudes of the presidency. I'm speaking here with Dr. Benjamin Studebaker. We're going to take another quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back. You are listening to Solution Space here on WRFG Atlanta. I'm your host, Adam Wadley, and I'm joined today by Dr. Benjamin Studebaker, the author of two recent books. One came out last year. It's called The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy. The Way is Shut. And the other book is coming out this month in just a little over 2 weeks on November 30th. Dr. Studebaker's book, The Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies, will be released. So just in time for the holidays. And so welcome back, Dr. Studebaker. I'm interested to ask you more about the national security state, as we've been discussing, and the secrecy that goes along with it. Because when it comes to the legitimacy of the government, we might think about that as, what is the citizen's opinion of the government? So if I'm thinking about, well, what do I think of the government? I have to immediately confront the question of how much there is about the government that is a secret, and so that I don't know. And of course, there is an easy reaction to that, which is to be very negative about it. So to think that, well, if certainly many things are being kept a secret from me that somebody doesn't want me to know about, and maybe because it reflects badly on them, so I'll think badly about it. But then, I'm almost thinking, you never know. Who knows? There could be some secret activities that they've saved my skin many times, right? So I'm just curious, as a matter of intellectual humility, or for me, it gets complicated because I respect skepticism so much. So I'm just sitting here suspending judgment. But so, how do you think about the issue of secrecy, the difficulty of knowing what's going on when we're trying to do analysis and offer the best possible ideas and understandings that we can in this time?
Yeah, the thing that stands out to me is that a lot of the people that you might think of as the powerful politicians who are in charge have frequently admitted in their memoirs and writings that they don't know what's going on, that people in the government they feel are hiding things from them. And this is something that is said by everybody. It's not something that's just said by some people. Uh, Part of the trouble is that this government is so large and so complicated that no one individual completely understands it. There are varying levels of ability to understand it. Some people understand it better than other people, but nobody totally understands this system. It's too complicated for any one human mind to fully comprehend it. And therefore, everybody is constantly having to worry about the things that they don't understand or don't know or aren't able to follow or pay attention to. So I think the citizen often feels estranged from the politician by this, lack of knowledge of what's going on. But actually, this is an area where ordinary citizens and politicians have a lot in common because none of them really fully understand what's going on. And a lot of the suspicion that ordinary citizens have is also shared by the politicians who act in their name, who are suspicious of the bureaucrats. And of course, the bureaucrats are suspicious of the politicians. The military in the United States, I think one of the things that differentiates it from the military in other younger democracies that haven't been around as long, in a lot of younger democracies, the military often will pursue its own interest against the democracy. So the military will potentially try to establish a junta or an authoritarian government that it can control. In the United States, the military very much thinks of itself as defending democracy from elected officials who might menace the system. So the military doesn't understand the elected officials as having a mandate necessarily because they're elected. It has its own understanding of the Constitution, how the Constitution is meant to work. Uh, and of course, some generals have different understandings precisely of the Constitution, how it's meant to work. But these understandings are potentially something that elected officials can conflict with. So they see themselves as safeguarding the Constitution against elected officials who may not understand the Constitution or may not be loyal in principle to the Constitution. And so one, early example of this would be the crushing of the bonus army by Douglas MacArthur. In 1932, during the Depression, a group of World War I veterans, a very large group, came to Washington, D.C. to ask for their World War I bonuses to be paid early because many of them were unemployed and experiencing economic hardship. The military became convinced, Douglas MacArthur became convinced that these people were communists. It wasn't true, but because he didn't have good information about what was going on inside the bonus army organization, because he didn't understand them, he thought that they were communists. So he ordered the army to bulldoze the bonus army camp with tanks and run them over with World War I tanks and crush their encampment, which then happened. Now, Herbert Hoover had not been informed, the president at the time had not been given proper information about the situation. So he had to pretend like he knew about this operation so as not to lose face. And then he had to adopt MacArthur's view that they were communists so as to look like he knew what was going on and was in control. So in this situation, you have the military not understanding what the civilian protesters are there to do, misunderstanding them and the character of what they're there for, right? And then you also have miscommunication between Douglas MacArthur, the military figure, and Herbert Hoover, the president of the United States. And so then there's a patchwork effort to make it look like everybody understood what was going on and the situation was handled competently. And if you look at the polling from 1932, most Americans were persuaded by the things that MacArthur and Hoover said. It was not the case that in the 1932 election, large numbers of people were voting for Roosevelt because they felt that this had been mishandled. There were totally different reasons people had for voting for Roosevelt that had nothing to do with the destruction of the bonus army camp. So this kind of stuff, I think, is much under discussed There's a lot more confusion on the part of elites themselves and people in government offices and in military offices and in the intelligence services than people tend to notice. There's just a ton of incompetence, which comes from just the limitations of human beings. We are just very finite creatures with limited bodies and minds that can only hold so many variables in them at once.
Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, we're coming up here toward the end. The next question is going to be involved. So I'll just remind, well, no, I'll bump it again at the end. So, okay. So I'm curious. I'm sure, of course, you've heard of the theorist Carl Schmitt. Carl Schmitt's well known for the friend enemy distinction, the idea of the state of exception. But I'm actually curious to know if you're very familiar with his idea of the theory of the partisan, because what I'm sort of thinking about in my mind is the way in which, it's almost like the idea of a legitimate government is almost, or a sitting government is almost going away, the standing army. Everybody's becoming irregular forces. So even as, people in civil society who are just trying to get justice for police brutality or something, people are, getting hit with RICO charges and being treated like, they're guerrillas. And on the other hand, you have people like Mark Milley, who used to be the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, right, saying that Donald Trump is a fascist, and crucially for me, Mark Milley said that here we don't swear an oath to a person, but to the Constitution. And crucially, Milley went on to say that it's loyalty not just to the Constitution, but the idea of America. So this is now standing out in my mind, where the people who are committed to this idea of America or American democracy, it's almost like we're becoming partisans for that. And the difference, as you're saying, in how we conceptualize what it is that we're partisans for leads to all these sorts of situations. And I'm curious for you to respond to that in a context where I feel like those of us who, I don't know, trying to do something, are also concerned about the legitimacy of social movements themselves. There is the government, and in a way, if the government loses legitimacy, maybe there's more rage capital or something for people to suck up into their organizations. But if some of the dominant organizations we have going right now, like the PSL or whatever, these organizations can themselves, or Black Lives Matter from a few years ago. But anyway, these organizations themselves face legitimacy issues. So in the 4 minutes that you have, I'm curious what you might say in response to all of that.
Yeah, I think in the 20th century and earlier, it was very common for theorists to think in terms of society versus the state, that when society and the state are estranged, then you'll have some kind of showdown between the two, with each having an organic unity to it, the people versus the elite. These organic unities that were posited and which many people believed existed in the 20th century, I think it's increasingly obvious that this is not what we have at this point. We have something that looks more like what Hobbes called a fractious multitude of many, many different organizations and many different factions. The thing is, because it's hard for the human being to make sense of the enormous diversity and plurality that now exists, we use heuristics and categories to try to make sense of it. And we try to reduce the complexity and the amount of disagreement so that it's something we can act with. And in practice, we are finding increasingly that our reductions are causing us to make mistakes. And so it's becoming increasingly difficult for us to imagine any way of acting or doing anything that wouldn't be based on a set of reductive heuristics that would result in mistakes. And so I think we have, in general, lost confidence in ourselves as people, in our ability to understand this system and do anything with it, because we don't believe we understand it increasingly. And those who do claim they understand it tend to get humiliated when it turns out that the heuristics that they've used to make sense of it don't quite grasp the level of complexity that is there.
Yes, that's absolutely true. Okay, so we're here at the end of the show. I'm going to do a final bump for you, Dr. Studebaker. I'm here joined by Dr. Benjamin Studebaker, author of 2 books so far. One came out last year called The Chronic Crisis of American Democracy, The Way is Shut. And your second book, Dr. Studebaker, is, of course, being released in 16 days. Count it down. On November 30th, 2024, will appear Legitimacy in Liberal Democracies. So we've got another little bit of time here. So if there's anything you'd like to emphasize here at the end, please do so. Thank you.
Well, I would say that very often when people get really emotional about American politics, it's in part because they have been told a story about why they should be scared of some other. and the other is always posited as having this unitary quality of being well organized with a clear vision about what it wants to do, I would say that the number one thing to bear in mind is that that other does not exist. There is no other group in American politics that is well organized and knows what it wants to do. There is just a lot of chaotic, badly thrown together social movements that aren't unitary, that don't speak for all of society, but just speak for various fragments and fractions, unknown even to themselves in many cases.
Is there anything you can say for us in just a few seconds about what's the upshot of that for us? What do we look for in such a scenario?
Well, I think that we are increasingly losing confidence in our ability to understand the system and act within it. So, what is happening? I describe democracy as a giant dinosaur with many heads stuck in a tar pit, and the many heads are thrashing around, but all of that does is stick you ever deeper inside the tar pit. It seems like there's a lot of activity and that a lot is happening, but in point of fact, no, the heads are constantly pulling in different directions. The beast doesn't know where to go or how to get out, but because it has very long necks, it's not in danger of drowning or running out of food or water anytime soon. It's going to thrash around for a good long while, and it's going to look like more is happening than is really taking place.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Dr. Studebaker, for joining us here on Solution Space. I'm the host, Adam Wadley, and we'll see you again next week. Hope to talk to you again. All right, thank you. And with that,
Thank you.
We're headed out. I will play the music. I'm not on the air anymore. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. That was a blast.
Wonderful. Yeah, as I said, you're welcome back again, and I'll make sure and send you a link when it's done. We've also been recording. We've been streaming live on YouTube, so that's also.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So I posted a link to that on X already, but I'll make sure and DM that to you as well, so it's easy to find.
Yeah, I'll be sure to tweet it out.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you. I'll
Thanks.
be in touch. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh my God. Hello? Yeah, that's right.